So, if you use Codex a lot, especially if you've been using it heavily over the last few weeks, you may have noticed something important. The 5-hour usage limit is back. And depending on how you use Codex, you're probably going to have one of two reactions. Either, okay, that makes sense. Or, wait, why would you bring that back? I'm definitely somewhere in the middle, because the story behind this change is actually more interesting than just OpenAI putting another rate limit on the product. For a while, the 5-hour limit basically disappeared for a lot of Codex users. OpenAI support later confirmed that the 5-hour Codex limit had been temporarily lifted for Plus, Pro, and Business users. So this wasn't just people imagining things or the usage page failing to display correctly. The short-term limit really had been temporarily removed. And honestly, during that period, Codex felt very different. If you had weekly usage remaining, you could sit down and have a genuinely long coding session. You could give Codex a bigger task, let it inspect the repository, make changes, run tests, debug something, come back, make another change, and just keep going. You weren't constantly thinking, how much of my 5-hour window do I have left? For people doing serious development work, that matters a lot. Because AI coding agents are not really like normal chatbots anymore. I'm not opening Codex just to ask, hey, how do I center a div? 2. I might ask it to understand an unfamiliar codebase, trace a bug through 5 different files, rewrite part of an API, update tests, run the project, find what broke, fix it, and then explain what it changed. That kind of workflow can easily turn into a multi-hour session. So when OpenAI temporarily removed that 5-hour layer, the experience became much more flexible. You still had to think about your overall allowance, especially the weekly limit, but at least you could decide when you wanted to use that. Allowance. If Tuesday was my big coding day, I could spend more of my quota on Tuesday. If Wednesday was mostly meetings, I could barely touch Codex. From a user perspective, that feels pretty natural. But now the 5-hour window has returned. OpenAI's current Codex pricing page once again explicitly lists usage in 5-hour windows, and it also makes something very important clear. The 5-hour allowance does not replace the weekly limit. Additional weekly limits can still apply. And I think that second part is what's going to frustrate some people. Because this isn't simply, you get a new allowance every 5 hours and that's it. You effectively have two different constraints. You have the shorter 5-hour window, and then you can still have a broader weekly limit sitting above it. So imagine you still have plenty of weekly capacity left, you're deep into a project, Codex has all the context, you're finally making progress, and then you hit the shorter limit. That's the moment where this system starts to feel restrictive. And people are already talking about exactly that problem. In the OpenAI developer community, users have reported seeing the restored 5-hour limit alongside their weekly limit, and some developers are arguing that the weekly-only system was much easier to work with for long development sessions. Now, there's another detail here that I think is really important. A 5-hour limit does not mean everybody gets the same number of prompts. The actual amount of work you can do depends on things like the model you're using, the complexity of the task, how much context Codex needs to process, the tools involved, and where the task is running. OpenAI's own documentation says that usage can vary based on the model, task complexity, context, reasoning, speed, and tools, and that a long-running task can consume substantially more allowance than a short request. That explains something I think a lot of people find confusing. You might see somebody online saying, I used Codex all afternoon and barely touched my limit. And then somebody else says, I hit mine incredibly fast. Both of those experiences can be real. If one person is making small edits to a relatively small repository, while another person is giving a powerful reasoning model a huge codebase and asking it to autonomously investigate a complicated problem, those are completely different workloads. This is also why I wouldn't obsess too much over counting prompts. One prompt can be basically nothing. Another prompt can kick off a huge amount of reasoning and tool use. OpenAI's current pricing page actually shows ranges rather than one fixed message count. On the Plus view, for example, the page currently shows different estimated local message ranges depending on the model, with lighter models generally. Stretching the allowance further, OpenAI also specifically recommends switching to a lighter model when you want your limits to last longer, and that probably tells us where Codex usage is heading. I think model selection is going to become part of the normal coding workflow. You're not necessarily going to use the strongest model for everything. If I'm asking Codex to rename a few variables, update a straightforward component, write some basic tests, or make a small CSS change, I probably don't need to spend my most expensive reasoning capacity on that. But if I have some horrible bug involving concurrency, architecture, or a code base I'd barely understand, that's when I want the stronger model. In other words, instead of thinking of Codex as one unlimited AI programmer, it probably makes more sense to think of it like a budget of compute that you decide how to spend. And personally, I think that's where the 5-hour limit becomes both understandable and annoying at the same time. I understand why OpenAI would want a shorter usage window. These coding agents can use a lot of compute, and if you give everybody complete freedom to consume their entire weekly allowance in one enormous session, you can imagine what happens when millions of developers all decide to do that at roughly the same time. There have already been periods where OpenAI investigated Codex users hitting limits faster than expected, including incidents related to rate limiting. So from an infrastructure perspective, having some kind of shorter window makes sense. It smooths demand. It prevents a relatively small number of extremely heady sessions from consuming a disproportionate amount of capacity at once. I get that. But from the developer's perspective, software development doesn't naturally happen in perfectly distributed 5-hour chunks. Sometimes I don't need Codex at all, and sometimes I need it for 8 hours. That's just how project work happens. And that's why I actually preferred the period where the weekly allowance was the main thing I had to think about. Give me a bucket. Tell me how big the bucket is, and then let me decide when I want to use it. If I burn through the entire thing in 2 days, that's my problem. I personally find that easier to understand than having a weekly allowance but also hitting another wall while there's technically still usage remaining. Now, if you're using Codex casually, I don't think this change is necessarily a huge deal. If you open it a few times per day, make a couple of changes, ask it to fix some bugs, and then go back to writing code yourself, you may rarely notice the 5-hour restriction. The people who are going to feel this most are the people treating Codex like an actual agent, people running large tasks, people working with big repositories, people letting it iterate for long periods, and probably people who've reorganized their workflow around the idea that they can delegate a substantial chunk of development to Codex. For those users, the return of the 5-hour window changes how you have to think about your sessions. What I would do is pretty simple. Stop using the heaviest model automatically. I'd keep prompts focused. I'd avoid dumping unnecessary context into every task. And I'd pay more attention to what Codex is actually doing instead of just repeatedly telling it to continue. Interestingly, those are very close to OpenAI's own recommendations. The current Codex pricing page suggests keeping prompts precise, reducing unnecessary project instructions, limiting unused MCP servers, and switching to lighter models. For routine work when you want your allowance to last longer? So maybe this is the bigger lesson here. AI coding is moving from the honeymoon phase into the resource management phase. At first, the only question was, how good is the model? Now there's another question. How efficiently can I use the model? And I actually think that second question is going to become increasingly important. Because once these agents are capable enough to work for hours, usage limits stop being some tiny technical detail buried in a pricing page. They directly affect how you structure your work. Do you give the agent one giant task? Do you break the job into smaller tasks? Do you use a lightweight model for 90% of the project and save the stronger one for the difficult 10%? Do you run locally through your ChatGPT allowance or switch to API usage when you need additional capacity? Those are becoming real engineering decisions. So, yes, Codex's 5-hour limit is back. The official Codex pricing information once again shows 5-hour usage windows, while also warning that additional weekly limits may apply. You can check your current usage through the Codex usage dashboard, and in the CLI you can use status stay to see what you have left. I don't think this suddenly makes Codex bad. Not even close. For me, it's still one of the most interesting changes happening in software development right now. But I do think the few weeks without that short-term limit showed us something important. Once developers get used to giving an AI agent longer, uninterrupted blocks of work, going back to tighter session limits feels surprisingly painful. And that may actually be the strongest evidence of how quickly these tools are changing the way we code. A year ago, we were arguing about whether AI could write useful code. Now we're arguing about how many hours per day we're allowed to let it code for us. That's a pretty dramatic shift. So I'm curious where OpenAI goes from here. Maybe the 5-hour allowance gets adjusted. Maybe lighter models become the normal answer for heavy users. Maybe pricing becomes increasingly credit-based. Or maybe eventually compute gets cheap enough that limits like this become much less noticeable. But for now, if you're using Codex regularly, I would definitely check your usage dashboard again. Because if you got comfortable with that period where the 5-hour limit disappeared, your workflow may need a little adjustment. And I'm very curious about your experience. Are you actually hitting the 5-hour limit? Do you prefer having a weekly limit only? Or do you think the 5-hour system is completely reasonable? Let me know, because I have a feeling this is going to become a much bigger conversation as more developers start using coding agents for serious, long-running work.